Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. This book talks about why people get so ridiculously far ahead in what seems like the shortest period of time. Now, I know lots of people can look at book subtitles like The Story of Success and be like,
what does this person know about success? I don't even know who they are.
But lots of people who don't know Malcolm Gladwell are missing out big time, because this guy researches, and he and Charles Duhigg, I'd argue, are some of probably the most painstakingly well-researched authors in modern psychology and self-help and business, or whatever you want to call the genre or set of genres that these guys write in. Outliers is a great book, and let's talk about why. He begins the book by defining the word outlier. 1. Something that is situated away or classed differently from a main or related body. 2. A statistical observation that is remarkably different from the others in value of the sample. There are 3 parts of the book. 1 is smashing that like button if you haven't already. It helps so much with YouTube ranking and video search and all that other stuff with the algorithm, and I'd appreciate that a ton. The other one is called Opportunity, and the third one is called Legacy. Now, what's interesting, and this is something Gladwell loves to do, he's a very clever writer. He has one sentence from each chapter that he puts in the beginning of the chapter, like right under the name of it. That makes you wonder,
dude, what is this chapter about?
He even does it for the introduction.
These people were dying of old age. That's it.
The mystery of these people, the Rosettans, went to eastern Pennsylvania, around the Northampton County, which is actually very close to where I grew up. They originally lived in Italy, but after inhabiting part of Pennsylvania, their little Rosetto village became its own world. Now, for some reason, they pretty much never had heart disease under the age of 65. Like, never. Which was basically a population unicorn in the 50s and 60s. The doctors looked at this and they looked at everything. They were like, what is it? Why don't these people have heart attacks? Like, it's kind of a weird thing to get mad at, but here's what it is. They didn't have heart attacks or really anything else. These people really were kind of just dying of old age. And the doctors looked at every single little possible factor that they could. There was no suicide, no alcoholism, no drug abuse, no crime or welfare. And there was nothing particularly amazing about the food they were eating or the lifestyles of their relatives. Or, you know, the climate and the air or anything like that in the foothills in eastern Pennsylvania. And ultimately, you know what it was? That was in the book. But I will give you a hint. It has to do with living in the actual town itself. If you watch the rest of this review, you can probably make a pretty educated guess as to what it is, in case you don't end up getting the book. But because the people you surround yourself with have a profound effect on who you are. A lot of people think that luck is only a result of hard work, but that's really only kind of the luck that you have control over. This book really explores people who take advantages of the right opportunities at the right times because of where they were and who they were with. He introduces us to many outliers in many different walks of life, like the Rosettans. So not just groups like the Beatles, but also people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Even like why Asians are so good at math, which had to do with standardized tests that everyone in the world has to take in public schools or private schools. You know, in North Korea and Japan and all these other places, they all tend to have like strikingly better grades than everyone else, to the point where you pretty much have to look at why. It turns out that had to do with how much easier it is to remember the lengths of the names of different numbers in Chinese and Japanese. But because of things like this, there are real roots behind stereotypes like that, and how it's especially true in places that are un-American. But he talks about what these people have in common that has absolutely nothing to do with things like skill or creativity or talent or planning or really anything of the like. A lot of people who study success, they hate it. Believe me, they really hate to think about these things. But it's like there's so much more to luck than just whatever. This book, as Gladwell puts it, is not about tall trees, but rather about forests. And I found that interesting. Like, isn't it a little weird that 17 out of 25 of the top hockey players in Canada, they were born in the first quarter of the year? There are just very skewed and, like, it can't be a coincidence birthday distributions. This is also with other sports like basketball and baseball and soccer. It's also the same thing with education, because those months from what's called the cutoff date, those months of, like, you know, maturity, are the difference literally between half having a chance at the middle class or not having a chance at the middle class for so many students. There are many people who have heard about something called the 10,000 hour rule who have not heard of this book. I figured it was at least popularized by this book because Malcolm Gladwell is a very well-known author. But when it comes to the 10,000 hour rule, the most simplistic and well-known examples that he could give us at the time of the writing of the book are probably the Beatles and Bill Gates, who were each exposed to 10,000 hours of training in their respective fields. All the little nuances of mastery you learn during those hours after maybe the first 2,000 or so, but they kind of compound almost in a physical way, to the point where you can almost like feel it in your bones. It's probably the closest thing to literally being able to do it in your sleep. The Beatles were handed an opportunity to play at a stripberg in Hamburg, Germany for 8 hours a night. 8 hours. They had to master chemistry, improvisation, covers, and stamina, and so many things, because they had to be able to do it for 8 hours a night. Every night of the week, for roughly a year. 56 hours a week. In a couple years, they played over 1,200 shows. That's more shows than most bands ever perform throughout their entire careers.
But what about Bill Gates?
Bill Gates was given an opportunity, it's probably my favorite little story of the whole book, honestly, to learn about personal computing and software coding at a really ripe age of
13.
in this rich private school that his dad had him going to. With, and at the time he spent teaching himself, there were probably like 50 people, not teenagers, in the world, with even close to his skill level, even the slightest closeness, none of which were even close to as young. Oh, and you know what's funny? Him, Steve Jobs, Eric Schmidt, who was the Google CEO for I think 14 years or something, and Steve Ballmer, who was the Microsoft CEO for I think 13 years, all four of them were born in the exact same 12 months time period last century. The next few chapters tell the stories of a few geniuses who the world had never heard of, or ones who were so smart that their intelligences were the reason why they ultimately didn't really amount to that much. So they were outliers, but really only in terms of comprehension and analysis. To me, even more interestingly, Gladwell tells the story. I have listened to probably 200 audiobooks now, and this dude and Charles Duhigg are probably the two best storytellers whose work I have had the pleasure of digesting. Of a law firm in Manhattan that scaled so quickly and became so successful that here, this quote should summarize it. For a period of almost 30 years, if you were a Fortune 500 company about to be taken over or trying to take someone else over, or merely a big shot or fix, Joseph Flom has been your eternity and Skadden has been your law firm, and if they weren't, you'd probably wish they were. On the ethnic theory of plane crashes, this stood out. Each of us has his or her own distinctive personality, but overlay on top of that are tendencies, assumptions, and reflexes handed down to us by the history of the community that we grew up in. And these differences are extraordinarily specific. If you want to know why Asians are so good at math, Jews are such good doctors and lawyers, or anything like that, this quote is a huge reason for it. Now, I didn't get his masterclass or anything on storytelling, so I don't know his exact approach to writing these books, but I still am under the impression lately that Malcolm Gladwell just asks himself from the start, what does everybody care about, but not know the explanation of? And what is the explanation that everybody thinks is true? And why is it wrong? Because there's always something that they're not looking at, and it always seems to have the biggest impact on the results. And I am always determined to find it, not so I can tell them they're wrong, because I feel like that'd be really petty, but more so that they can look more divergently and further open their minds to what is really out there that doesn't meet the eye the first glance or the second or the third. And I feel like in personal development and history and psychology and stuff like that, whether what I just described is the reason he wakes up every morning, I personally think it's a pretty damn good one. Malcolm Gladwell, as a personal brand, seems to be all about that something. And I feel like this book is that something in terms of what success truly comes from and how it's really generated. I have never heard any book that states something so similar yet peculiar, and I'm still listening for more of them. You can believe me when I say I have my ears wide open. From the ending of one of the last chapters, which was about inner city and underprivileged kids, and why their grades tend to be lower than kids who live in higher income areas, This stood out. The myth of the brightest and the self-made man suggests that in order to bring out the most of human potential, we need only to identify those with promise, and our work is done. We look at Bill Gates and say in a spirit of self-congratulation, "Our world allowed that 13-year-old to become fabulously successful as an entrepreneur." But that's the wrong lesson. Our world only allowed one 13-year-old unlimited access to a time-sharing terminal in 1968. That time period is really specific. If 1 million teenagers had been given the same opportunity, how many more Microsofts would we have today? Isn't that profound? Don't you think that question demands like a redefinition of the story of any like massive success? I mean, there's an interview at the end of the Audible version with Gladwell and he talks about the book. Obviously. He really dove into things like the Bill Gates story. When you think about it, outliers really aren't even outliers. They're kind of just things that happen as a result of the course of nature. And what's so amazing about the whole 1968 thing is that computer terminals at the time, to have access to, were worth millions and millions of dollars. And not really even adults, any of them, had access to them. So by the time he had 10,000 hours under his belt, it's like he was, roughly 21 years old, or maybe even younger. So he was so far ahead of like literally everyone on the planet in an emerging field, like just barely emerging, that was already worth millions of dollars. Now, something else is that, this may sound like it goes against a lot of stuff that I said in this video already, but the hard work does play a huge part. You don't just start a company and all of a sudden have thousands of employees and hundreds of millions of products sold to and used by customers in the comforts of their own homes. It's like this mix of opportunity and legacy and kind of dedication. But if guys like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were born within 6 months of each other, between late 1954 and early 1955, that can only mean one thing. There is no coincidence. Because that's when the invention of, a personal computer took place. And these people really kind of just took advantage of it. Now, the extraordinary thing about stuff like this is, I don't know about you, but personally, I start to think of what's out there today. What kind of opportunities are out there today, and how many of them are kind of increasing, and like, how many of them are now within our control because of the ones that happened at the time, musically speaking with the Beatles, or linguistically speaking with, the Asians and the math, or especially with the personal computing, and how many things are kind of just being pumped out by places like Silicon Valley and Seattle and Houston and all these other really high-tech cities and towns. But how much of the fact that they are there for us at whatever time, whatever place, how much of that is under our control? If this book sort of demands through its contents the redefinition of success as time has passed by, don't you think it kind of makes you wonder what that time has demanded in terms of a redefinition of opportunity and legacy? I don't know, just something to think about. Here are the quotes. There are really only 2 of them. You could look into his eyes and see the intelligence burning behind them. No one who can rise before dawn 365 days a year fails to make his family rich. Direction 1. I recommend this book if you are utterly convinced that success has absolutely nothing to do with luck, genetics, inheritance, and that it's like 100% work ethic and mentality. Direction 2. If you like this book, I recommend checking out Blink, also by Malcolm Gladwell, about the power of thinking without thinking. I also recommend The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He talks about unpredictable events and what determines their probability or lack thereof, as well as, how people learn 1 or 2 things about them and kind of thread them together as explanations and sort of jump to conclusions when there's so many, like almost an infinite amount of details that they're not even considering, let alone figuring out for themselves. I think it's similar to Outliers because Outliers talks about a specific set of examples where people jump to these conclusions, even though Black Swan uses an avalanche and kind of throws it our way of different reasons and theories and all sorts of things as to why things do and or do not happen. The guy who wrote the book, The Black Swan, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, you can tell just by his writing style that he's like insane. in a good way in my opinion. Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. There's a link in the description if you guys want to check it out and read the reviews. There's also links in the description to all the other books I mentioned in this video. If there are any other books you guys want me to listen to and review, please let me know in the comments below. But also let me know in the comments below if you checked out this book and you like it. But if you like this video, make sure to leave a thumbs up. Chances are, if you have watched this far into the video, I don't see a point in not subscribing. If you like this video and my other videos, however, and you can turn on that little bell to receive a notification every time I drop a new one, that would mean so much to me. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can find me everywhere, and I will see you then.